Under a sky thick with iron-gray clouds, the Ardennes forest groaned under the weight of winter. It was December 16th, 1944, the opening day of the Battle of the Bulge. Snow clung to tree branches like ash, muffling the crunch of boots and the low, trembling hum of engines struggling through the cold. German Panzer crews, dressed in thick wool coats and black leather, watched the distant American lines through fogged binoculars. They smirked. Across the valley, GIs wore open-collared jackets, loose-fitting field shirts, and soft caps that looked more suited for a mechanic shop than Europe's deadliest battlefield. To the veterans of the Wehrmacht, it was laughable. The Americans looked careless, almost unmilitary. But that illusion wouldn't last long. The first artillery strike shattered the calm. A rain of fire erupted over the treetops, turning snow to steam. German infantry surged forward, confident, shouting orders clipped and sharp in the frigid air. Yet what they met was not chaos. Through the smoke, the Americans moved fast, too fast. Their olive-drab jackets blended with mud and frost, their canvas leggings slick with ice. They crouched, fired, shifted positions, and disappeared. No bright insignias, no rigid lines, just shadows, fluid and adaptable. The Germans, used to textbook formations and polished uniforms, were facing something far stranger, a fighting force that looked sloppy but struck with deadly precision. Days earlier, many German officers had mocked captured American uniforms. They called them unfit for war. Cheap cotton, mismatched layers, and thin fabrics that couldn't possibly withstand an Ardennes winter. They looked like factory workers, one lieutenant was heard to say. He wasn't wrong. Many of those soldiers were factory workers, truck drivers, and farmhands turned warriors. But what the Germans didn't realize was that those same loose, layered designs, those casual uniforms, were products of a new kind of warfare, one the U.S. Army had been quietly refining for years. Unlike the crisp tunics of the Wehrmacht or the thick wool of the SS, the American M1943 field uniform was designed for function, not formality. It wasn't meant to impress on parade grounds. It was meant to survive. Each element, from the multiple layers to the weatherproof shell, had been tested across theaters from Italy to Normandy. The casual appearance came from adaptability. Soldiers could add or remove layers, dry garments faster, and move more freely through terrain that chewed up heavier uniforms. The Germans sneered at what they thought was softness, but in reality, they were looking at industrial pragmatism forged in American factories that never slept as the battle deepened. The Ardennes became a graveyard of overconfidence. German tanks bogged down in snow-choked roads. Their crews shivered inside cramped steel hulls, frost creeping over dials. In contrast, the Americans, often under-equipped, sometimes freezing, still managed to maneuver. They dug foxholes with bare hands, wrapped scarves of cut-up blankets, and layered every scrap of cloth they had. Their uniforms, designed for flexibility, allowed for improvisation. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. They had been trained to fight with precision, not adaptation. But in the chaos of the Bulge, precision was a luxury no one could afford. By the second week, the snow turned brown with mud and blood. German troops advancing through the forests around Bastogne began to realize something unnerving. The enemy they thought disorganized was holding, fiercely. American infantrymen, drenched and caked in muck, looked like ghosts of the earth itself. Their uniforms, once mocked for being too plain, now blended perfectly with the battlefield. The olive drab faded into the sludge, and the canvas absorbed the grime. They were invisible until they fired. A German sergeant, peering through his scope, muttered in disbelief, "They're part of the ground." His men thought he was joking, until another burst of M1 fire cracked from the brush. Every inch of the American uniform now served its brutal purpose. The cotton poplin shell repelled water better than wool. The layers trapped heat when dry and could be stripped when soaked. The lack of shiny buttons or insignia prevented detection in the snow glare. Even the field jacket's deep pockets became lifelines, storing chocolate bars, extra ammo, or a crumpled photograph from home. It wasn't glamorous, but it was human. The Germans' tailored elegance was losing to industrial simplicity. The heart of the transformation was something far larger than fabric. It was philosophy. The German army had built its image on perfection. the disciplined soldier Eine pressed uniform, symbol of the Reich's order and superiority. But the Americans, shaped by mass production and improvisation, had built theirs on adaptability. Their soldiers didn't need to look perfect. They needed to work. A sergeant could patch his jacket with a tint flap, wear gloves that didn't match, or wrap his feet in spare rags, and still fight effectively. The system didn't rely on uniformity. It relied on resilience. The Battle of the Bulge exposed that contrast with brutal clarity. In the frozen forests around St. Vith and Elsenborn Ridge, units that were supposed to collapse under German armor instead dug in. The 99th Infantry Division, green troops, some barely out of training, held their ground in snow up to their waists. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces raw from frostbite, yet they fought with grim endurance. German intelligence reports noted unprecedented American resistance despite poor equipment. The truth was simpler. Those casual uniforms allowed movement, adaptation, and survival in terrain where rigid doctrine froze to death. Mud became the great equalizer. As the roads turned to sludge, the Germans' polished boots and pressed trousers became liabilities. The Americans' rough, layered look, once the subject of ridicule, was now the mark of those who could endure. Every stain of mud, every frayed sleeve, became a badge of survival. In the foxholes of Bastogne, soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, tarps, and whatever the supply lines could provide. The M1943 field jacket became more than a garment. It became a shield against a winter the Germans had thought would destroy the Allied front. When German prisoners were finally marched past American lines weeks later, many stared in silence at the men who had stopped them. They saw soldiers covered in grime, faces streaked with soot, and uniforms mismatched and torn. But those casual men had done what the Reich's finest divisions could not. They had held. And the mockery that once filled German camps turned into something else, a quiet, reluctant respect. By January 1945, the Ardennes had thawed into a wasteland of churned earth and twisted metal. The American lines still stood. The uniforms that had once seemed symbols of inexperience had instead become emblems of endurance, proof that victory wasn't always worn in perfect folds or shining buttons. It was earned in dirt, sweat, and frost. As the last echoes of artillery faded, one truth became impossible to ignore. In the mud of the Bulge, America's casual soldiers had rewritten what it meant to look ready for war. And deep in the forest, where the snow still bore the imprint of fallen men, the myth of the careless American vanished, buried under layers of grit, courage, and olive drab resolve. Under the skeletal trees of the Ardennes, dawn came slowly, a gray ghost creeping over a battlefield buried in snow. The fog hung so thick that even the silhouettes of men seemed to blur into the forest. On December 22, 1944, the American lines around Bastogne looked shattered, encircled by German armor, battered by artillery, starving, and freezing. Yet inside that icy ring of death, something strange held firm. The same casual soldiers once mocked for their loose-fitting field jackets and mismatched gear were still there, still fighting. And now, it wasn't just survival. It was defiance. The secret wasn't luck or brute endurance. It was design. The M1943 field uniform, born from months of testing and brutal lessons in Italy and North Africa, was the quiet advantage that no one had noticed until now. It had been crafted not by generals or parade officers, but by engineers and textile experts back in the States. The Quartermaster Corps, working with the Philadelphia Quartermaster Depot and countless factory foremen, had stripped the uniform down to its essence, practicality. Layers could be swapped as weather changed, cloth could dry quickly, and soldiers could move without the stiffness of traditional wool. The Germans had dismissed it as laziness. But what they were really seeing was evolution. Every piece of the American kit served a tactical purpose. The cotton sateen outer shell was wind-resistant but flexible, perfect for crawling through hedgerows or frozen brush. Beneath it, soldiers wore layered shirts and wool liners that trapped body heat but could still breathe. The ankle boots, paired with canvas leggings, might have looked cheap, but they let water drain faster than the high leather boots of the Wehrmacht, which often froze solid in the snow. Even the soft field cap, the one German officers had scoffed at as unmilitary, could be stuffed under a helmet liner to keep ears from freezing. These were not parade uniforms. They were tools, and every wrinkle told a story of survival. As the siege tightened around Bastogne, that functionality began to show its worth. While German units fought to keep engines running and rifles dry in the freezing muck, American troops were adapting. They learned to strip off wet layers, hang them over smoldering embers, and put them back on before dawn. The olive drab tones blended seamlessly into the churned snow and blackened tree trunks. Machine gunners disappeared into the landscape. Riflemen shifted through the fog like ghosts. The German advance slowed, not just from resistance, but from confusion. Their intelligence reports described invisible American defenders who seemed to reappear after every barrage. Behind this adaptability stood the power of industry. Back home, assembly lines at companies like the Bluebell Overall Company in Pennsylvania and the Detroit Quartermaster Depot were producing millions of field jackets, trousers, and boots every month. The design's simplicity made it easy to mass produce. Fewer specialized materials, faster stitching, less dependence on scarce resources. This was America's hidden advantage, an army that could clothe itself endlessly, with uniforms that worked in every climate from Sicily's dust to Belgium's snow. Where the Germans struggled with shortages and repair bottlenecks, the U.S. supply machine simply replaced what broke. The men at the front might not have known the names of the workers who made their gear, but their lives depended on those unseen hands. The German army, meanwhile, faced its own winter catastrophe. Their uniforms, though elegant, were never meant for this kind of cold. Many soldiers had only summer tunics under thin greatcoats. The armored divisions advancing through the Ardennes were forced to scavenge from fallen enemies or abandoned depots. Some wore captured American jackets over their own uniforms. A strange irony unfolded. The same garments once mocked by the Wehrmacht now became their salvation against the cold. The casual look spread through German ranks out of necessity, not pride. In the fog-shrouded woods near Foy, an engagement broke out that would define the battle's human scale. A platoon from Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment held their position against relentless German assaults. Mortar shells tore through trees, raining splinters like knives. Men hugged the frozen earth, their M1 rifles heavy with frost. But even as temperatures dropped below zero, they held. Their jackets, soaked and stiff, still allowed movement. The long tails of the M1943 coat covered the hips, shielding vital warmth. Pockets carried ration cans that froze solid but stayed accessible. Every inch of the uniform was being tested to the limit, and passing. A German officer observing the fight from the opposite ridge scribbled in his report that the Americans seemed to live in the mud like beasts, yet they fight like machines. That paradox was no accident. The Americans' lack of formality had become their armor. Their clothing let them endure the filth without losing combat efficiency. Their mindset mirrored their uniforms, flexible, layered, and unpretentious. By Christmas Eve, the forest floor had turned into a brown swamp beneath the snow. Tanks were immobilized, and the supply lines were almost dead. In the frozen silence, small fires flickered in foxholes. American troops huddled under ponchos and tarps. The green fabric now faded to the color of wet clay. They shared cigarettes, swapped gloves, and patched tears with thread from their sewing kits. The M1943's deep pockets held more than gear. They carried scraps of humanity, letters, chocolate, photographs. The uniform wasn't just fabric anymore. It had become part of their identity, a second skin molded by hardship. Elsewhere, in the northern sector near Elsenborn Ridge, artillerymen from the 2nd Infantry Division fired round after round into advancing German columns. Smoke and snow mixed into a choking haze. When enemy shells struck, the men ducked behind their howitzers, their coats stiff with ice. Yet the design allowed them to stand, pivot, reload, and fire again without the bulk that hampered the enemy's heavier wool. The difference between mobility and immobility meant life or death. The Germans, realizing their offensive was slowing, sent frantic orders for reinforcements. But what they didn't see was how their own supply lines were faltering under the same snow. The Americans' lightweight, interchangeable uniform had a logistical advantage that extended far beyond comfort. It simplified transport. Shipments could be mixed and matched, reducing confusion and delay. A jacket made for one division could fit another with minimal adjustment. That flexibility, invisible on the battlefield, was devastating in its effect. By the final days of December, the fog of the Ardennes began to lift, revealing wrecked panzers and bodies frozen in grotesque stillness. The casual soldiers still stood, caked in grime, faces cracked with cold but eyes unbroken. The uniform that had once looked unprofessional now seemed perfectly at home amid ruin. It wasn't designed for display. It was designed to endure. For the Germans, the shock was complete. Their polished doctrine, neat lines, perfect gear, visual discipline, had shattered against an enemy that fought like the terrain itself, uneven, adaptable, and unyielding. The battle proved that survival didn't come from appearance, but from design that embraced imperfection. And as the smoke cleared over the Ardennes, one question lingered. If a simple, practical uniform could turn mockery into fear, what else had the Americans engineered that the enemy had yet to understand? When the snows of the Ardennes finally began to melt in early January 1945, the wreckage of a once proud German offensive lay scattered across Belgium's frozen hills. Burned-out panzers jutted from the slush like tombstones. The last great gamble of the Reich had failed, and its soldiers, who had once mocked their American foes as undisciplined amateurs, now trudged past them as prisoners, beaten, frostbitten, and stunned. The Americans looked nothing like the images from propaganda posters. Their jackets were faded, stained, and torn. Their boots were caked with grime. They looked like laborers, not conquerors. Yet it was those same casual men, clothed in the very uniforms that had been ridiculed, who had broken the back of Hitler's final counterattack. The transformation was deeper than mere clothing. In the mud of the Bulge, the American soldier had proven that adaptability was not the opposite of discipline. It was its evolution. Where the German army had demanded precision, the Americans demanded results. The M1943 uniform had become a symbol of that mindset, layered, flexible, practical, and human. It represented a military built on ingenuity rather than rigidity, and that spirit radiated far beyond the battlefield. Engineers back in the United States, working around the clock in unheated factories, had built not just garments, but an entire system of survival, one that linked frontline improvisation to assembly line precision. That system would go on to define American warfare for generations. The lessons of the Ardennes spread quickly through military doctrine. Commanders realized that equipment had to serve soldiers, not the other way around. The next generation of field gear, from the tropical fatigues of Vietnam to the modular systems of the modern U.S. Army, would all trace their lineage. To that winter in 1944, the philosophy of adaptability had proven its worth in the coldest crucible imaginable for the German army. The psychological blow was immense. Reports from captured officers spoke of disbelief. They had expected the Americans to collapse under the weather, to surrender when surrounded, and to break without warmth or supplies. Instead, they found an army that bent but did not shatter. The Americans' muddy appearance, their relaxed posture, their improvised shelters, all the signs of disorder that German doctrine despised, had masked a terrifying efficiency. They were fighting a different kind of war, one that valued function over form, survival over spectacle. In countless after-action reports, German soldiers described how they had been unnerved by the Americans' endurance. They spoke of enemies who seemed impossible to exhaust, who fought on through conditions that made men numb and weapons brittle. It was a subtle shift in perception, from disdain to reluctant respect. The so-called casual look had concealed a kind of resilience that the Germans, with all their precision and hierarchy, had never prepared to face. Meanwhile, back home, the story of Bastogne spread like wildfire across America. Newspapers showed photographs of weary GIs smiling through the frost, their uniforms tattered but their spirits unbroken. Those images redefined what courage looked like. It wasn't the clean, heroic figure in a pressed uniform. It was the mud-streaked soldier crouched in a foxhole, grinning despite the cold, the smoke, and the fear. The American public saw in those faces not just victory, but identity. The idea that strength could coexist with imperfection, that grit mattered more than glamour. Industrial America, too, took pride in what had been proven. Factories that had once produced workwear and overalls realized their products had helped shape history. Textile engineers refined materials further, creating new weaves and waterproof coatings. Designers who had studied soldier feedback began to develop the prototypes that would become post-war field jackets, lighter, stronger, and more adaptable still. The war had shown that every stitch, every rivet, and every decision on a factory floor could influence the outcome of battles continents away. To be why the time spring came to Europe, the war was nearing its end. The lessons of the Bulge were burned into the minds of commanders and civilians alike. American soldiers marched through German towns wearing the same jackets that had once been derided. Now, even German civilians whispered in awe at the sight of them. Men who looked like they'd risen from the earth itself, unstoppable, unshakable. That visual, the unpolished warrior in functional gear, became the new face of power in the modern world. That in post-war analyses, military thinkers noted a profound shift. The age of the immaculate uniform had passed. Future wars would not be won by the sharpest crease or the brightest metal, but by the side that could endure the elements, innovate quickly, and sustain its soldiers in the harshest environments. The mud of the Ardennes had rewritten the manual of warfare, and at its core stood the American GI, ordinary, imperfect, yet unbeatable. Even decades later, veterans remembered the texture of that winter. They spoke not of glory, but of the feel of wet cloth against their skin, of frozen sleeves thawing by tiny fires, of the dull ache in their fingers as they reloaded rifles in sleet. For them, the uniform wasn't just something they wore. It was a companion that bore the weight of exhaustion and fear with them. Many kept their jackets long after the war, patched and frayed. As a reminder of the days when survival depended on simplicity, the legacy endured into the Cold War, where lessons from the Ardennes influenced NATO doctrines and survival training. Flexibility, field improvisation, and layered clothing became central to the soldier's toolkit. Even in modern conflicts, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, echoes of that philosophy persist. The modular combat systems and moisture-wicking fabrics of today are the direct descendants of the olive-drab ingenuity that saved lives in the winter of 1944 in museums and memorials. The M1943 jacket now hangs behind glass, a relic of an age when design and endurance fused into one. To the untrained eye, it still looks simple, almost plain. But to those who know its story, every pocket and seam carries history. It represents an army that refused to die in the cold, a generation that found strength not in perfection but in persistence. When veterans returned home, they carried that lesson with them into civilian life. They had learned that adaptability, the ability to face uncertainty and make do with what's at hand, was the essence of survival. That mindset built the America of the post-war years: flexible industries, dynamic leadership, and a culture that valued innovation over appearance. The spirit of the soldier in the mud became the spirit of the nation itself. As the years passed, and the forests of the Ardennes grew quiet once more, the world slowly forgot the laughter that had greeted America's casual uniforms in 1944. What remained was the silence of respect. The mud, the cold, the suffering. They had tested an army's soul and found it stronger than anyone imagined. In that silence lies the final truth of the Bulge, that victory is not always born from polish or power. Sometimes it rises from the dirt, from men who look ordinary but endure the impossible. And somewhere beneath the melting snow, buried deep in the soil of Belgium, the ghosts of those soldiers still stand, their faded jackets blending into the earth they refused to yield.